Hello and welcome back to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. The next item of business this morning is an evidence session on the future relationship negotiations between the European Union and the UK Government. And can I welcome to the meeting the Right Honourable Michael Gove MP, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Minister for the Cabinet Office, and Lindsay, Appleby, the Deputy Chief Negotiator and Deputy Sherpa with Task Force Europe of the UK Government. We have around 1 hour for the evidence session today, so I would therefore be very grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. Before we move to questions, I would like to invite Mr Gove to make a brief opening statement. Good morning, Mr Gove.
Good morning, Joan. It's a pleasure to appear in front of the committee. I just wanted to say that in various different roles that I've had in government, I value the opportunity to talk to parliamentarians from all of the devolved administrations, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you very much. That is your brief opening statement.
That's all.
That's very welcome and very brief. Thank you very much. Mr Gove, our committee in the course of this inquiry has heard many witnesses who have said it's vital that the UK Government extends the transition period if we're not to face a double disaster of a COVID recession and a no deal or a low deal Brexit. Last week you were asked about your government's refusal to extend transition when you appeared before the House of Commons Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. You told them that the reason the UK Government had taken that position is because staying in the transition period would mean continuing to pay into the EU without having a voice in the multinational financial framework that determines how we would pay. Is that still your position? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me, Joan? Sorry.
Yes, I can hear you. Could you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. No, I was going to say that the position hasn't changed. No, absolutely.
Right, okay. Thank you for that, because my understanding is that the withdrawal agreement is quite clear that the amount we pay is determined by a decision of the withdrawal agreement joint committee, which you co-chair. So not only then does the UK Government have a voice, it co-decides and ultimately it can veto any proposal, and that's stated very clearly in the withdrawal agreement, I believe in Article 132, paragraph 3.
We've been clear that right from the moment that the Prime Minister won the general election, the basis on which he won the general election was that we would not extend our time in the transition period. Were we to do so, it would be the case not only that we would be liable to continue paying into the EU, it's also the case that the multi-annual financial framework would be set by the EU 27, not by us. It's also the case that we would be subject to new laws that the EU could pass without our input or say, and our ability to meaningfully put in place the measures which might help us to ensure that we have an effective recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic would be less. And I think it would be mistaken, foolish, perhaps naive to assume that in the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee, that if we asked for an extension, that the EU 27 would allow us to dictate how much we paid. I think that they would say, you want an extension, that's fair enough, but you are still benefiting, as they would see it, from unimpeded access to the single market and everything that goes with that. And so, just as you've been paying in during this transition period, right up to the end of the MFF in 2020, so you must continue to pay in. So I think that we'd be on the hook, as it were, for a significant sum.
Well, that is what you told the Northern Ireland Committee last week. I mean, if I could just quote Article 132, paragraph 3, it says, a decision of the Joint Committee under paragraph 1 shall A, establish the appropriate amount of the contribution of the United Kingdom to the Union budget for the period from the 1st of January 2021 to the end of the transition period, taking into account the status of the United Kingdom during that period, as well as the modalities of payment of that account. I mean, that seems to me, if you're co-chair of the Joint Committee, surely you could negotiate a good deal, given that the alternative would be to crash out with a low deal or no deal in the middle of a COVID pandemic.
I think it would be the case that we would be a price taker, not a price maker, in such a negotiation, because As I say, the EU 27 would be agreeing what their budget was overall, and I don't think that they would say that we could have discount membership. I think, as I say, that would be naive. So formally, of course, it's open to the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee, or was open to them, to agree that we should extend and then to agree what it is that we should pay. But as I say, agreement in that case, I think, would not be a process by which the UK would be able to determine price access, as it were. I think it would be one in which the EU would politely but firmly inform us of what our obligations were and invite us to agree to accept that price for continuing membership of the, or continuing extension, rather, I should say, of the transition period. And again, people can disagree about whether or not extending is a good thing or a bad thing, but it would certainly be the case, and for reasons already outlined, and which we may go into further. I think it would be wrong to do so, undemocratic indeed, but nevertheless, it would come at a price.
Well, thank you for that answer. I don't think we're going to agree on this. I'm just quoting what the withdrawal agreement says, which seems to give you more influence and power than you seem to think that you have. But we are tight for time, so I shall now move on to Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask a question around business preparedness. In a letter to the committee on the 9th of June, Michael Gove said that businesses will need to prepare for life outside, both at the end of 2020, and many have already done so. It would appear that some businesses have done this by relocating out of the UK and moving their head offices outside of the UK. And we did hear evidence from Ali Renison a couple of weeks ago from the Institute of Directors, who expressed concern over the level of uncertainty that businesses are facing. Given the very short timescale we have until the end of the year, how businesses are able to prepare for something that is currently unknown. She did also argue for a transition phase, an implementation phase that would be a formal stage that would follow from the end of the year, so starting on the 1st of January. Just if the Chancellor could, if the Duchy could talk a bit about that and how he believes that businesses should be preparing given the level of uncertainty.
Thank you, Claire. I think it is the case that in the first instance, we have actually seen a number of businesses which had been thinking about where they were going to locate both their headquarters and additional production, deciding that they wanted to reshore, that they wanted to have more jobs and to invest more in the United Kingdom. So we saw Unilever, which at one stage was contemplating moving its headquarters to the Netherlands, in fact say no, the UK is going to be the base of operations for the future. And of course Nissan on Sunderland decided that it wanted to reshore production in the UK. So we've seen a number of companies say actually the UK's future, notwithstanding the difficulties of the COVID pandemic, is bright in the medium to long term, and therefore that's where we want to be. And you make the point about certainty, which I think is important. And by making it clear that we won't be extending the transition period, there is a greater degree of certainty, I think, for business. And of course, it is the case that whether or not we secure a free trade agreement of the kind that we talked about, a Canada-style deal, whether or not we secure precisely that free trade agreement, then businesses do know that we will be outside the single market and outside the customs union, and therefore, come what may, whether or not there is that FTA or we leave without that specific FTA, that businesses will need, for example, to prepare for new customs declarations and other processes.
I suppose, as an addition to that, when will businesses know what the new customs arrangements are going to be? If we're looking at a 6-month period for them to prepare and they're still in the dark about what this might be, go back to Ali Renison's point, would there be an opportunity for a more formal, whether that transition period that would allow businesses to adjust to what the new rules might be, given they don't know what they are at the moment? And as a link to that, you gave evidence to the House of Commons Committee in April around Operation Yellowhammer and any preparations and analysis of economic impact on if we were to leave without a deal, which creates even more uncertainty for business. Could you respond to those points? And in talking about analysis, does the UK government do any analysis that is specific to Scotland and the issues that we face in specific sectors we have?
A series of important points that you raise. The first thing is we have communicated to business, and the Border and Protocol Delivery Group communicated to business a few weeks ago what the arrangements at the border would be. And of course, government always can do more in order to make sure that businesses and others are prepared. But the nature of the relationship that we will have with the EU, whether or not we get a free trade agreement, is clear, and the business requirements, for example, on customs declarations, have been made clear as well. On the broader point about the economic analysis, of course we conduct economic analysis all the time, but there are so many variables at play, not least because of the COVID pandemic, that it's important to draw a distinction between economic analysis and modelling and prediction. And sometimes people place an enormous amount of emphasis on models and assume that that model is a predictor of the future. It's not. But we do know that, for example, the Scottish Government has done some economic analysis of the impact on the fishing industry of being outside the Common Fisheries Policy, and said that being outside the CFP would, in their estimation, create thousands of jobs and millions of pounds of additional revenue, and that is certainly an analysis with which we agree.
Thank you. We now move to Patrick Harvey, followed by Annabel Ewan.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Mr. Gove. When the JMC-EN was established, the UK government, in agreeing its remit, committed to work collaboratively with the other governments within the UK to seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for Article 50 negotiations. It does seem as though instead of seeking to agree an approach to and objectives for those negotiations, the UK government has simply decided and then told the devolved governments what the situation is. Mr. Russell told us on 19th of May, the UK government published its legal draft text for the negotiations, which was shared with the Scottish government less than 24 hours before publication, with no opportunity to amend. So is it accurate that the UK government has shown no intention to agree a joint approach with the other governments of the UK and has merely imposed its own solutions? And if that's not the case, can Mr. Gove give us a list of examples where the UK has changed its negotiating position as a result of the input by the other governments?
I think it's fair to say that that characterisation is not wholly accurate. What we have done is that we've had extensive consultation with the devolved administrations in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. To take an example again, on fisheries, it is the case that work has been done with DEFRA officials and Scottish Government officials in order to make sure that the approach that we take on that uniquely important issue is one that takes account of the fact that the majority of fish that is caught and landed by the UK fleet is caught and landed by Scottish boats in Scottish harbours.
Okay, I'm surprised that's the end of the answer. It seems that Mr. Gove doesn't have a list of examples, or any examples, in fact, where the UK government has changed its position as a result of input by the other governments. I mean, this has led to a situation where both the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government refused to take part in the most recent ministerial meeting, an online meeting. They simply refused to take part. Isn't it the case that the intergovernmental relationship is fundamentally broken as a result of events of recent months and years? And what does the UK government intend to do differently, if it has any intention at all of repairing that broken relationship and actually beginning to share power properly between the elected governments and parliaments of these islands?
I think it's important to say that I don't believe that it's broken. Quite the opposite. There's been regular contact between myself, other UK government ministers, most notably the Paymaster General Penny Mordaunt, and representatives of the devolved administrations. And when we are negotiating, we do take account of specific Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland interests. And again, on everything from thinking about the impact of a free trade agreement on the livestock sector, to considering how we can ensure that we maintain the economic equities of vital parts of the United Kingdom economy. We are negotiating in the interests of the whole UK. Of course, there are sometimes disagreements. You might expect that when you have people from different political parties and traditions in those conversations. So Mike, again, has a clearly expressed view on the nature of the relationship that he and others in the Scottish Government would like to see with the European Union. That's not the view of the UK Government, and it's not the view of the majority of people who voted both in the original 2016 referendum and who voted in the recent UK parliamentary elections. But I always benefit, and my colleagues always benefit, from hearing from Mike, Jeremy Miles, and others. Their expertise and insight is appreciated and, where appropriate, incorporated.
Thank you very much. We now go to Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our guest, Mr. Gove, this morning. Picking up on some of the points just raised, we had a session with Michael Russell last week, and the picture painted was really quite different. Examples of, the negotiation round details being provided to the Scottish Government only 24 hours before they started. Lack of any information forthcoming from the UK Government about levels of preparedness and planning. No pre-briefs, no debriefs in terms of the various discussions in Brussels. And indeed, Michael Russell did say that, in his view, the Scottish Government and the other devolved governments were being treated as mere stakeholders rather than governments of nations of the UK. And he did, in answer to my question, agree that there was no respect agenda. And he did go as far as saying that it is now difficult to trust the people that he has to deal with. And so I would have thought Mr. Gove would place a huge importance on the issue of trust. And is he not therefore worried that this is the inevitable view that the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary has reached?
I think it's fair to say that Mike always gives a good account of himself in whichever committee structure he's participating, whether that's in the JMC-EN or whether it's appearing in front of this committee. He's a fluent and effective advocate. That same fluency and effectiveness is brought to bear in our JMC-EN discussions and in other fora in which Mike and other Scottish Government ministers participate. And of course, we take proper account of the arguments that they make. But again, there is a difference of opinion. It is the case that the Scottish Government has a view on the nature of the relationship that the United Kingdom should have with the European Union, which is not the view of the United Kingdom government. So inevitably, if you have a difference of that kind, then it will be the case that not everything that Mike believes the UK government should be doing will be done by the UK government. And so he is free to express his disagreement with us, and he does, as always, in effective, fluent and precise terms.
Well, I think if Mr. Russell were here to speak for himself, he would say that he always advocates the Scottish interest and stands up for the Scottish interest. But turning to another area of concern, the area of bilateral trade deals, obviously there are many issues that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but notwithstanding that, there appears to be the same level of disengagement on crucial issues. We have heard of very, very serious concerns on the part of farmers in Scotland about the lowering of food standards, and indeed people of Scotland in general, about the lowering of food standards that some of these deals may entail. And all we have heard in response to these very deep concerns, I would respectfully suggest, are platitudes. And I would ask Mr. Gove, what trust should the people of Scotland place in the judgment of UK government ministers like himself, who is on the record as saying that it is wise to drive around for 30 minutes to test your eyesight?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that when we're looking at trade agreements, that we take very seriously the importance of protecting our high animal welfare and environmental standards. And your question gives me the opportunity to state that those protections already exist in law. We are not going to dilute them. The Department for International Trade engages with the devolved administrations, as do all government departments, when we're discussing free trade agreements. But when I was fortunate enough to be the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary of State in the UK government, I would regularly talk to colleagues Fergus Ewing in the Scottish government, Leslie Griffiths in the Welsh government, about making sure that we could have an approach which safeguarded animal welfare and put the environment at the heart of everything that we did. And I was pleased to see recently that the lead that the UK government was taking on the establishment of an Office of Environmental Protection and the adoption of high environmental principles was one that the Scottish government had sought to echo and emulate. And I think that that's been incredibly helpful. And again, I quite agree with Annabel that Mike is a very effective advocate, but I think that there's a distinction to be drawn. The Scottish government is, of course, rightly exercising a series of devolved responsibilities. But when Mike speaks for the Scottish government, he doesn't speak for everyone in Scotland.
Thank you. We now move to Oliver Mundell to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. During the course of our inquiry, we've heard a lot about fishing. Fishing is very important, as you've already said, to Scotland. I just wondered if you were able to confirm that it's the UK government's strong position that the United Kingdom should be an independent coastal state moving forward, and that's in strong contrast to what we hear from the Scottish government, whose position would leave Scottish fishermen trapped in the common fisheries policy.
You're absolutely right, Oliver. One of the benefits of being outside the European Union is that we can have full control of our exclusive economic zone. That means that we can decide who fishes in our waters and on what terms. At the moment, because of the nature of our accession to the European Union in the 1970s, it's the case that in that exclusive economic zone, other countries have significant access to our waters. We want to make sure that we are an independent coastal state, exactly as you say, so that just like Norway, Iceland and the Faroes, we can allow others in, but on our terms. That means, as we touched on earlier, as the Scottish government's research has shown, that will be more jobs and more money for Scotland's coastal communities, particularly but not exclusively in the northeast of Scotland. And it also means that we'll be able to manage stocks in a more environmentally sensitive way. So it's a win-win, economically and environmentally. And you are right that the logic of the Scottish government's position of wanting us to remain within the European Union would mean that we would be in the common fisheries policy. And if at some future date, and I hope it doesn't happen, but if at some future date there were an independent Scotland and that independent Scotland wanted to accede to EU membership, it would have to accept the common fisheries policy. Scotland would lose control of its territorial waters, and of course, under current terms, Scotland would also have to agree to join the single currency, and that would create additional economic turbulence, not just for coastal communities, but across Scotland.
Thank you for that response. I think Scottish fishermen will be pleased to hear the UK government's going in to fight for that prize that Brexit delivers. I also wondered, you've talked already about the political differences between the Scottish and UK government on Brexit, but over 1 million people, as you know, voted to leave the EU and Scotland. And do you share my concern that the Scottish government tries to present staying in the customs union and staying in the single market as Brexit? I don't think that's what those people voted for. And do you just recognise that there is just an impasse there that where a compromise couldn't be found?
That's very fair. Again, the Scottish government's position is well known, well rehearsed, and presented, as I mentioned, by Mike and others very clearly. But it does run counter to the clearly expressed commitment in the EU referendum to leave the customs union and the single market, and indeed many of those who were arguing that we should remain pointed out that leaving would mean that we would leave the customs union and the single market. David Cameron and others made that clear. And you are right, 1 million people, 38% of the population of Scotland voted to leave. And I think it's important that when the Scottish Government presents a case on behalf of the people of Scotland, that it takes account of the views of those people, because their decision was taken in a considered fashion, and the Scottish Government should seek to represent their views to the best of its ability.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Gove. I'd like to go back to Patrick Harvey's question a few moments ago when he asked about ways that Scottish Government have successfully influenced the development of UK policies. Could you provide the committee with 5 examples of where each of the devolved administrations has successfully managed to get the UK Government to actually change its policies and change its maybe some of the negotiating tactics for Brexit?
Well, I think that it's important to recognise that the JMC-EN and indeed in the negotiations take place in an environment where there is give and take, and it may well be the case that both during those negotiations, and because of their sensitivity, they're inevitably conducted in private, that during those negotiations there is inevitably give and take as different positions are tried out to see whether or not there might be movement, and it's always best in those negotiations to make clear that there's flexibility. But the whole point of the JMC-EN is that it's a private discussion, and the whole point about our negotiating stance is that we shouldn't negotiate in public. That's not how international negotiations do take place. What I can say is that if we think about everything from, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland rely to a greater extent in agriculture on livestock production than England does. If we take account of the fact that there are specific equities that Scottish producers have, again, in the agri-food sector because of the prominence of geographical indicators. If we take account of the fact that the Scottish Government has said that access to the Erasmus programme is something to which they're strongly attached. If we take account of the fact that the Northern Ireland Protocol and its implementation has to take account of the specific legacy of the Belfast Agreement, if we take account of the fact that as we look again at Wales's economic future, we need to be certain that sectors like not just agri-food, but also manufacturing have the right deal. All of these are areas where our negotiating stance is shaped and framed by a determination to do the best for the United Kingdom. And of course, in doing that, we're listening to the Scottish and Welsh governments and the Northern Ireland executive. But of course, from time to time, our judgment about what might be in the interests of the whole of the UK differs from that of, say, the Scottish Government or the Welsh Assembly Government. But that is, of course, because the party traditions and the political philosophies of different politicians, while it's always good if they overlap, do inevitably diverge in certain circles.
Shaped and listening to doesn't indicate actually being amended or fulfilling any of the suggestions. But certainly I'd be grateful if you could write to the committee with specific examples, because as you quite rightly said, these negotiations are taking place privately, not in public, quite rightly. So it would be very useful for us to actually have that particular detail. But you did mention Erasmus there, Mr. Gove, and I've got a question specifically on that. And I will make you aware that I studied through an Erasmus scheme beforehand, so I genuinely know how important the scheme is. You'll be aware that Scotland benefits disproportionately from participation in the EU programmes such as Erasmus Plus and also the Horizon 2020 programmes, and these particular programmes are of huge importance to this committee. In your recent letter to the committee, you stated that the UK Government is, and I quote, considering participation in the next generation of these, including Horizon 2020 and Erasmus+, which are due to begin in 2021 and are currently under negotiation, where it is in the UK's interests, we are open to participating in some EU programmes, including elements of Erasmus+, on a time-limited basis, provided they are in line with UK interests and we can agree a fair and proportionate financial contribution. In the same letter, Mr Gove, the Scottish and Welsh governments also requested, and I quote, confirmation that in the negotiations on participation in EU programmes, the UK government will respect the devolution settlement by asking for, where appropriate, the option for devolved administrations to continue participating even where you have decided on behalf of England not to do so. So how do you respond to this request from both the Scottish and Welsh governments?
Some very important points that you make there, Stuart. On the first one, about listing, I think it's important that I refer to the Ministerial Code. Paragraph 2.3 of the UK Government Ministerial Code says that the internal process through which a decision has been made should not be disclosed. Neither should the individual views of ministers or advice provided by civil servants as part of that internal process be disclosed. And that's in order to have a safe space for discussion. So I've mentioned a number of areas where we've taken account of the specific interests of the devolved administrations, and more particularly the people within Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But I don't think it would be right. I can understand it's a perfectly legitimate question, but I don't think it would be right to give a blow-by-blow account of the discussions that do take place. That would run counter to good practice in policy making and the need to have a safe space for these discussions to take place and for advice to be offered. On the point about a programme like, oh, sorry, you come back, yes.
I wasn't asking for a blow-by-blow account.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand, but I'm explaining the context. On the point about...
You move on quite quickly, so it's just 2 questions per member.
On Horizon and Erasmus, the important thing is for the UK's involvement in any EU programme, we need to make sure that it is value for money. And one of the things that we do know is that Scots universities, because of their excellent research base, benefit particularly from involvement in the UK-wide allocation of research funding. As in so many ways, Scotland benefits financially from being within the United Kingdom because of the strength of the UK Treasury and its institutions. So we'll look at future participation in Erasmus and in science programmes. We hope that we will be able to participate in them, but it does need to be value for money. One thing that is unambiguously value for money is Scots universities having access to UK research.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr Gove. Operation Yellowhammer was alarming reading, and I wondered if you believe those warnings still apply in the context of a no-deal scenario. Might those warnings be worse now, given all that businesses and governments have had to deal with in the last 6 months? And are there particular areas that might be more vulnerable now than they were, say, 6 months ago? For example, supply chains. And actually, what is the status of operational Yellowhammer now?
Well, Operation Yellowhammer was specifically set up in order to deal with a no-deal outcome. Now, we do have a deal, the withdrawal agreement, and that means that some of the questions which would have been unresolved if we hadn't secured that withdrawal agreement are now resolved. The position of Northern Ireland through the Northern Ireland Protocol, the rights of EU citizens in the UK, and so on. Now, of course, you are absolutely right to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has created difficulties for citizens and businesses across the United Kingdom. But we believe that the most important way in which we can help businesses and help citizens is providing certainty about the end of the transition period and using the strength of the UK exchequer to underpin an economic recovery.
Chancellor, can I move to citizens' rights? The coronavirus shone a light on the enormous contributions the EU make to public services, our economy, our society. And the lockdown has meant that the closure of scheme support centres, local scanning centres, etc., has made it more difficult for EU citizens and EU nationals to apply for the ID needed to make applications. The Home Office claimed that they would be able to ensure that every EU citizen has settled status by next year. Do you think that's credible? And should the deadline for the settlement scheme be extended to take account of the impact of COVID-19?
It is credible. I don't see any reason to extend that deadline halfway through next year. And I think it is the case that some 3.2 million EU citizens in the UK have applied for settled status. That's more than we actually imagined were the number of EU citizens in the UK. It was widely believed to be around 3.3 million rather than 3.2 million. And you are right. The presence and the participation of EU citizens in the life of the UK is a good thing.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Gove. I'm just wondering, Mr. Gove, if you can explain how law enforcement and security provision will be enhanced by the end of transition.
Well, I think it is the case that when we take back control of our borders, that we will be able more effectively to decide who comes into our country and on what terms.
So things like the European arrest warrant and things like that, cooperation with European police and security organisations, you actually think that will actually improve, do you, in terms of delivery of the efforts to impact on organised crime, smuggling, etc.? You seriously trying to suggest that will actually be the case? And if that is the case, does that mean that all this cooperation in recent years with Europe has been detrimental to the UK?
Well, it's important to recognise that, for example, when it comes to security and intelligence cooperation, that is done on a nation-state to nation-state level. It is a nation-state competence. And we have a number of tools and areas in which we freely cooperate with our European neighbours, and indeed also cooperate with other countries outside the EU in order to keep our citizens safe.
Could we unmute Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson, could you repeat your question?
Oh, apologies. Can I ask, with regard to financial services, Glasgow and Edinburgh alone employ 62,000 people in financial services, worth £6.3 billion in exports last year. I'm just wondering again how the ending of transition will actually benefit this key sector, given that the CBI has said that the overall economy will shrink by 3.5% in the first year of the end of transition. And I'm thinking particularly about sectors like life insurance, where Scotland has 24% of the UK's entire employment in this sector, and of course the loss of the benefits of passporting.
Right, that financial services matter a great deal to the economy of the United Kingdom and Scotland, and I should say that it's not just Edinburgh and Glasgow. In Perth and Aberdeen, indeed across Scotland, there are people employed in financial services. It's also important to recognise that the EU should grant equivalence to the UK when it comes to financial services. That's an autonomous EU decision. It's not something that is subject to negotiation. But it's also the case that a number of voices in financial services have said that the ability of the UK to thrive outside the single market is greater. It's important that we are not a rule taker when it comes to making sure that we have the right regulatory and legal framework for the success of the financial services sector.
Thank you. Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Convener. Mr. Gove, we've seen in the current pandemic how important many key workers are in different areas, including the NHS and so forth. And some of these workers are not necessarily currently paid at levels that many might think appropriate to the importance of the work that they do. And I think we've seen, as I say, in the current pandemic, this emphasised. Now, in Scotland, as in many parts of the United Kingdom, those who work in tourism, the care sector, or indeed seasonal agricultural workers might be thought to fall into this category of people who are essential, but perhaps at the lower paid end of the scale. And when I was on the Economy Committee in the Scottish Parliament, we heard evidence from a number of Scottish companies about some of the issues, and often they would say that they couldn't actually remember when they last tried to recruit workers within Scotland, in spite of there being lots of unemployed and indeed unemployed younger people. And it seemed that it was simply easier to simply bring workers in from the rest of the European Union at lower paid rates. Now, the Secretary of State for Scotland, when he gave evidence to this committee, said that he hoped that as a result of us leaving the EU, we would see a rise in wages for people who are lower paid so that their work would be properly remunerated. How do you see this developing going forward?
Point, and I completely agree with the Secretary of State. One of the features of economic analysis that was highlighted during the referendum and subsequently is that while immigration is vital and valuable, it is the case that uncontrolled migration in certain areas can depress the wages of some workers. And there have been a number of very important thinkers on the left, like the Labour PM Maurice Glassman and the Fire Brigade Union ex-official Paul Embury, who have made that point very clearly. So the Secretary of State is right, and I think you're right as well, Gordon, that one of the things that we do need to look to in the future is making sure that all work is properly valued, and that people who may not have been paid as they should have been paid in the past enjoy the opportunity to see their earning power increase.
Thank you for that answer. And I know that, and you'll be aware that, of course, training and education skills programs and that are, of course, devolved. But are there other examples from other areas of the United Kingdom that we can look to see in terms of approaching this issue now that we are out of the EU and indeed after the transitional period is over?
Yes, I think it's a very, very good point. And I think one of the things that I would like to see and to encourage is the adoption of good practices from different parts of the United Kingdom in the education and training sector. And I know that whether it's the apprenticeship levy or whether it's looking at giving more day-to-day control over schools to head teachers and professionals, there is good practice that we can all share, and I think it's critically important that that we do so, because you're absolutely right. One of the ways in which we increase productivity overall as a country is by improving education alongside infrastructure. And one thing that I think that would be beneficial overall would be to make it easier for students from every part of the United Kingdom to study in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gove. We have a little time in hand, which is great. Thank you to Mr. Gove and to our questioners. Can I return to your appearance before the House of Commons Northern Ireland Committee last week, Mr. Gove? You said that businesses in Northern Ireland will, as has been recognised because of the protocol, have certain advantages that businesses in other parts of the UK may not enjoy, whether or not we have a free trade agreement. I represent the south of Scotland, and obviously businesses, that includes Dumfries and Galloway in the southwest of Scotland, which would see Northern Ireland businesses as often as their direct competitors. What words of comfort do you have to them, given that you're saying that Northern Ireland businesses will have an advantage over these Scottish businesses?
All of us recognise the gains that have been made in the last 22 years as a result of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. You know, all of us, I think, would want to make sure that Northern Ireland continues to prosper. I think it's the case that if we look at Scotland's history, the ties of affection and respect between citizens of Scotland and citizens across the island of Ireland, including Northern Ireland, are strong. You know, we don't what's the word? We don't make ourselves stronger by pulling others down. So standing in solidarity with the people and the businesses of Northern Ireland, making sure that they can build on the successes that they've had over the last 22 years is something that I think that that Scots would want to do. And it's certainly the case that if Northern Ireland businesses are succeeding, then that means that the trade that plies from Larne to Cairn Ryan, and which benefits people in Dumfries and Galloway, can continue to flow freely. And I think that's good for all of us.
Yeah. I think people in Scotland and in Dumfries and Galloway in particular do have strong fraternal ties with Northern Ireland and wish them very well, but that doesn't mean to say that they want to be put at a competitive disadvantage.
Businesses in Scotland enjoy a number of competitive advantages as a result of being part of the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland businesses have unfettered access to all of the UK. Scotland's businesses, Scotland's consumers benefit from the strength of our UK internal market. If that internal market were to be fractured, then that would be the greatest competitive disadvantage that Scotland's businesses could be faced with. And that's why I think that the Northern Ireland Protocol, the commitment to unfettered access for Northern Ireland goods, and the strength of the UK internal market overall give all businesses confidence and a competitive edge.
We have another supplementary from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you again, Convener. Mr. Gove, the WTO are suggesting that anything between there'll be a 13 to 30% fall in world GDP in 2020. And on the 4th of June, when Philip Rycroft appeared in front of this committee, part of the discussion centred around the 2018 modelling that he was part of for the UK government at the time. And Mr. Rycroft quoted just on the day, and I'll say it now, it's modelling, 2018 modelling did not accommodate at all, because of course it could not have done, was the impact of the coronavirus on macroeconomic conditions, around which I absolutely accept that there are huge uncertainties. With this being the case and the challenges that we are going to face economically, do you therefore not agree that it would be wise to therefore look at some of the financial frameworks that are in place, particularly that between the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament and the UK that was signed in 2016, because clearly the macroeconomic conditions changed somewhat?
I think there are two important points there. I think the first thing is, as Philip very helpfully and graciously acknowledged, the whole point about economic models is that they cannot accurately predict the future. The famous unknown unknowns will always occur. But within that, one of the ways in which we can most effectively safeguard the prosperity of the United Kingdom is, as I was touching on with Joan earlier, making sure that we have effective working across the UK, and that we have a strong and free-flowing internal market.
Thank you. We have a supplementary from Kenneth Gibson, MSP.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Clearly the pandemic has hampered negotiations, and I'm just wondering if there will still be negotiations outstanding by the end of October, and if so, what areas of the UK economy will struggle as a result of being unable to conclude negotiations this year and the lack of an extension of transition?
We had a high-level agreement just the other week with the Prime Minister talking to President Ursula von der Leyen, President David Sassoli, and President Charles Michel, and it was agreed that we would accelerate the pace of negotiations, in the phrase that was used, put a tiger in the tank, and that is why the pace of negotiations is picking up, because there's a determination on all sides to ensure that we can make progress.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing, MSP.
Thank you, Convener. It was mentioned a wee while ago about the folk in Scotland who chose to vote no in 2016, and that indeed is the case. Some did, but 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU. All recent studies have shown that the forcible removal of Scotland from the single market and the customs union would be hugely damaging for the economy of Scotland. So my question to Mr. Gove is, people didn't vote to become poorer. Why do you want to make my constituents of Cowdenbeath poorer?
The last thing I would want to do is to make people in Cowdenbeath or anywhere in Fife poorer. I'm in politics in order to spread prosperity and to generate greater equality of opportunity. One of the things, though, that would make people in Cowdenbeath and Fife poorer would be if Scotland were to leave the single market and the customs union of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Did you want to come back, Annabelle?
To say, it's utter nonsense. And the thing is, and going back to the key issue of trust, the question I first raised with Mr. Gove, the key issue of trust these days in politics, people hear these tired messages and they just don't believe you guys anymore, I'm afraid, Mr. Gove. They don't really believe you.
Well, again, I think it's unambiguous that I don't know anyone really who would contest it, that if Scotland left the United Kingdom, that it would be poorer. Andrew Wilson, a gifted economist, in the Growth Commission report that was commissioned by the First Minister, pointed out that Scotland would undergo additional austerity as a result of independence. Now, it's a perfectly, obviously, legitimate view held by people like Andrew and others that is a price worth paying. But I think that Andrew's work draws attention to some of the weaknesses in the white paper that was published by Alex Salmond when he was First Minister, making the case for independence. And I think when we talk about trust, and I do take your point very seriously, we improve trust in politics when we are honest about trade-offs. And I think that Andrew's work, including, I think, on the radio last week, saying that an independent Scotland, faced particular economic challenges, would face particular economic challenges as a result of COVID. I think that sort of candour helps rebuild trust, and I think that the approach that he has taken in spelling out the price of breaking up the United Kingdom, that sort of candour is helpful in the debate.
Thank you. We have another question from Claire Baker, MSP Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. If I just go back to the issue of the withdrawal agreement and the current negotiations. So before the general election, the political declaration was agreed with the EU, and I do accept that was non-binding. But I was someone who wanted us to remain within the EU, and I'd still rather see us within the EU. However, the political declaration, I think, did give possibly a broader interpretation of what the relationship could be like that would maybe get broader support across the UK. The UK government seemed to have moved quite a bit from the content of the political declaration in the recent negotiations. I mean, do you think what is left of the political declaration that is relevant? Is it still it no longer appears to be the basis for the negotiations, which it was intended to be?
It is very much. It provides a framework for the negotiations, and it allows us to reach what I hope will be a mutually beneficial free trade agreement. So the political declaration certainly does act as the framework. And you are right; it allows for a variety of different levels of relationship and agreement, but it's definitely the framework, the foundation on which the negotiations are conducted.
Thank you. We have another question from Kenneth Gibson. If we could keep it as brief as possible, and then we'll make our deadline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. I don't recall any Conservative politician praising Andrew Wilson when he was an SNP MSP. Is it not the case that he, like 54% of Scots, believes in independence because we know Scotland will be a more prosperous, just and equal society when Scotland is indeed an independent nation once again?
Again, Andrew's view is clear. I have great respect for him, but I think it's also clear, as the Growth Commission report pointed out, that Scotland would undergo greater austerity if it were independent. Scotland has, if it were independent, would have the biggest deficit of any country in Europe. That economic pain and turbulence, some might consider to be a price worth paying in order to secure the goal of independence, and that's fair. And I think that Andrew's candour in that respect is helpful. And as I say, the publication of the Growth Commission made clear that some of the claims that were made in the Independence White Paper that was produced in the 2014 referendum were perhaps over-optimistic. I think if we look back at that white paper and look, for example, at some of the projections that were made on the price of oil and what that would do for Scotland's economy, I think we can show that those predictions, if not heroic, were certainly at the optimistic end. And I think that the greater degree of proportion and candour that Andrew's brought to this argument is helpful. Of course, I don't agree with him on every aspect of it, but I do think that some of these difficult truths that Andrew has helped to surface and enable us to grapple with allow us to look more clearly at the economic cost of separating Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's not just an economic cost. I also think that it undermines the principle of social solidarity, which is such an important part of the United Kingdom's history as well. My view is that folk in Scotland, like people in Northern Ireland, Wales and England, have the same values of social solidarity, and it's important that we uphold those values across all parts of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. We do have 3 minutes in hand. If I could just quickly ask Mr Gove before we finish up, again returning to the Northern Ireland Protocol in the southwest of Scotland, if we don't get a deal, where will the checks take place between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and where will the infrastructure be built to do those checks?
There's no need for any infrastructure in Scotland because it is the case that Northern Ireland businesses will have unfettered access to the UK internal market. It is the case that there'll be some additional requirements on checks on products of animal origin because we're respecting the island of Ireland status not just as a single epidemiological zone but as a single SPS zone. But it's already the case that for live animals there are checks at Larne and Belfast, and so we'll be building on the existing systems that we have there in order to ensure that checks are appropriate. And it is the case, of course, that physical checks on products of animal origin apply only to a small proportion of those goods.
But what about other goods that are bound for the Republic of Ireland from Scotland? Where do the checks on those goods take place?
Well, if they're bound for the Republic of Ireland, then it will be the case that customs procedures will be conducted, and we believe that they can be conducted electronically as the goods make their way there. But it is the case that the overwhelming majority of trade between the UK and Northern Ireland is intra-UK, as it were, reinforcing the importance of the United Kingdom's internal market and the fact that we all benefit from those economic, social and cultural ties.
Yeah. I'm talking about the proportion of goods that are going to the Republic of Ireland, and we've had a look at the custom. We've had a look at the electronic methods that are already in place at the ferry terminal, and it's quite clear that although many of the containers that are going across to Northern Ireland are marked, that there are containers where you do need to investigate, and so you would need additional electronic infrastructure if you didn't get a deal for goods going to the south of Ireland.
Well, I'd be grateful for the detail that the committee would wish to provide on that, but I think that the fears that some have expressed, I believe, are misplaced. But of course, I'd be very, very grateful for any documentation that the committee wished to share to look at trade flows, to look at specific goods, and to see if there are any additional concerns that we can safely address through the work of HMRC.
Yeah, because the withdrawal agreement obviously absolutely forbids any checks apart from you mentioned animal ones, but any new checks on the island of Ireland would not be acceptable in terms of the withdrawal agreement.
Indeed, the reason why the protocol exists is to safeguard the gains of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and to ensure that we can have unfettered access for goods circulating within the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland stays within the United Kingdom customs territory, but it also enables provisions which ensure that there need be no physical infrastructure at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll certainly share any evidence that we have gathered with you, Mr Gove. And that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session. Can I take the opportunity to thank Mr Gove for his evidence today in what has been an extremely helpful evidence session as the committee continues to scrutinise the future relationship negotiations. And we look forward to taking evidence from Mr Gove later in the year to assess whether progress has been made in these negotiations, which are, of course, of critical importance to Scotland. So thank you very much, Mr Gove. The committee will consider the evidence heard in private shortly, and that concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. I will